Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Hearer, if we have no self, no soul, no substantial existence, then what exactly gets reincarnated?
This is a good question, and it's one that is often asked whenever people are learning about the teachings of the Buddha. How do we reconcile non-self and reincarnation? The answer is that when we die, our five aggregates, meaning our form, our physical sensations, our perception, our mental formations, and our consciousness, re-aggregate and reform according to our past karma. All things change over time, and so too do living things. The re-aggregated being is not the same as they were previously, and they will continue to change after that as well.
That most definitely fits with the doctrine of non-self. I suppose that though there is no permanence, that does not mean we are subject to random chaos. There is no substantial existence in anything. Though there is no substantial existence in anything, that does not mean there is nothing at all in the world.
Indeed. This is the middle way. On one end of the spectrum, there is absolutely nothing at all. And on the other, everything exists with permanence and substantiality. In the middle is reality, where things exist, but only provisionally, conditionally, and temporarily.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing the term emptiness in the context of Buddhism. What is emptiness? What are the different definitions of this word? How does the definition change over time? We hope you enjoy. So let's get started. What is emptiness?
Emptiness, or Śūnyatā, as it's said in Sanskrit, is an extrapolation of the doctrine of non-self, or Atman. To understand emptiness and non-self and their context, we should discuss a little bit of the Brahmanical tradition that existed in India at the time of the Buddha's life. As we've mentioned before, Brahmanism is the pre-modern predecessor to modern-day Hinduism, and it is the tradition to which Buddhism was responding to in many ways. In Brahmanism, there is the belief that there is a self, or there is the Atman, as one might say in Sanskrit. And the goal is to unify this Atman with the Brahman, or the supreme divine. This is known as moksha, or liberation, and is achieved by attaining self-knowledge, or Brahmajnana. This self does reincarnate over time into different bodies and forms, but there is something about it that ultimately stays the same over the course of this process. This is what we might think of as a soul. It is this intangible and unchangeable part of ourselves that transcends the physical and determines our consciousness and self-awareness. This is an extremely simple rendering of Brahmanism and what is going on in it, but it provides the context for why they believe there is a self and how the Buddhists respond to that idea. Buddhism famously rejects the idea of a self and instead puts forth the doctrine of anatman, or non-self. This doctrine rejects the idea that there is a soul of any kind, that there is a capital S self, or that there is an unchanging thing that exists in any sentient being. And that later gets extrapolated into emptiness, which rejects that there is an unchanging aspect to the existence of anything at all, sentient or not. This postulation is based on the doctrine of impermanence. It is an observable fact that everything that exists was something else before, and it will be something else in the future. I am an adult man right now, but I was a child in the past, and I will be an old man in the future. A coffee mug was previously dirt in the past, and one day it'll be a different kind of dirt in the future. There is nothing at all in the world that is not subject to impermanence. So why would people or sentient beings be any different? Going from that, if there is no Atman in sentient beings, no self, no soul, no substantial existence, why would there be one in anything else? This is how we arrive at the doctrine of emptiness. We start at anatman, and we extrapolate beyond just sentient beings to the rest of things in reality. The result is the doctrine that because everything is impermanent, it must not have any substantial aspect to its existence. If something were to exist forever, that would violate the doctrine of impermanence. And if it only exists for a finite period of time, that means that it's insubstantial. It's absent of a soul or a continuous dimension to its existence, and it's empty. It is merely a temporary manifestation of the causes and conditions from which it arises. We should be careful, though. It's easy to take emptiness to the extreme and drop something important along the way. Just because there is absolutely nothing in reality that has any substantial existence does not mean that nothing in reality is quote-unquote real. What I mean by this is that while the doctrine of emptiness may be true, it does not reject the experience you have day by day where you can see, touch, smell, taste, hear, and cognize things around you. That's going to be important to remember when we get into debates about emptiness in just a moment.
So, what are the different definitions of this word?
So there was wide debate in the early Buddhist doctrinal branches about how we ought to understand emptiness. To give some context for this debate, we should discuss some of their philosophies. We have discussed how there is the idea of a small d dharma, which is just any one thing in reality. A computer is a dharma, happiness is a dharma, water is a dharma, etc. Dharmas have characteristics. They have the sensory characteristics that we can attribute to them, and they have the characteristics of their actions. For example, water has the characteristic of flowing, of temperature, of satiating thirst, etc. Dharmas have characteristics, but it is incorrect to say that dharmas are their characteristics. All dharmas, in addition to all their other sensory characteristics, are marked by the three marks of existence. These are the three dharma seals: non-self, impermanence, and dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness. If literally everything in reality is marked by these characteristics, doesn't that mean that non-self, impermanence, and dukkha are also each marked by non-self, impermanence, and dukkha, respectively? To put it more simply, are the characteristics of dharmas actually dharmas themselves? And does that mean that they are marked by the three dharma seals? This is the debate of the definition of emptiness. Is emptiness a thing in itself, or is it simply a characteristic of things? This question has big implications. If emptiness is a thing in itself, it is marked by impermanence, and that means that in the future it could change into something that is not emptiness, such as fullness. If it is a thing in itself, it is marked by non-self, and is therefore empty itself. That gets kind of confusing. Recursive emptiness all the way down. The other side of this debate holds that characteristics of dharmas are not dharmas themselves, and therefore are not subject to impermanence, non-self, and dukkha. This is the side that actually eventually wins out in Mahayana Buddhism. To put it simply, impermanence, non-self, and dukkha are not data points themselves, but they are observations of data. To put it another way, gravity itself is not subject to gravity. Gravity can't fall because of gravity. Evolution cannot itself evolve into something that is not evolution, like creationism. If that were to be the case, if gravity could fall because of gravity, if evolution could evolve into something else like creationism, that would create paradoxes and oxymorons that can't be resolved. Since that has resolved into the Mahayana discourse on emptiness, we have seen emptiness in ubiquity. Among all the different strains and flavors and schools of Buddhism in East Asia, one might say that things like emptiness, impermanence, dukkha, non-self, non-duality, etc. are the only common threads, and a lot of other things can vary very widely.
So one problem I'm having getting these definitions down myself is everything that we've been talking about here sounds like impermanence rather than like, I don't understand the distinction at this point between impermanence and emptiness. Do they mean the same thing, or is there a distinction that I'm not grasping here?
I think that the relationship between impermanence and emptiness is an if-then statement. So emptiness and impermanence each have their own definitions that are actually like declarative statements, right?
So if something is impermanent, then it is also empty?
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
To put it simply, though, for the declarative statements, impermanence is the statement that things change over time, right? Things will not be the same in the future as they are now, and they are not now the same as they've been in the past. That one's very easy to grasp. But the implication of that is where we get into the if-then statement. The implication of that is that if something is changing constantly over time, that must mean that there is not anything inside of it that is unchangeable. And this is a very nuanced observation of change over time. Think about the coffee cup that we talked about earlier. There is nothing in the makeup of the coffee cup that is unchangeable. There's nothing in the structure, the color, the use, the weight. All of that stuff is subject to change. How it feels when we touch it, what it looks like, how we cognize it. All those things are subject to change over time. And therefore, if there is no singular anything in it that is permanent, then that must mean it is empty of any substantial existence. That substantial existence would be something that would give it permanence. That would be something that is unchangeable. That would be something that does persist and contradict impermanence. So that's kind of how those two are connected to each other. And this, of course, as we've been saying, it relates to non-sentient things, but it also relates to sentient beings as well. Everything about a person changes over time, and therefore there must not be anything within or about a person that is unchangeable and permanent and does not change over time.
Could we perhaps frame emptiness as being subject to change? Is that what it's trying to talk about? Or is there a different term there?
That's what this debate is about. Is emptiness itself subject to change? And
well, no, that's not what I meant. I meant could we define emptiness as being able to change or being subject to change? Rather than, I'm not talking about emptiness itself being subject to change, although
Sure.
We do need to talk about that. I'm just talking about, I'm trying to understand somebody comes up to me and says, what does emptiness mean in Buddhism? And I don't have a clear answer for that yet, because it's we've been talking about the implications, we've been talking about the terms around emptiness, but we've been talking about the context around emptiness. But what does it actually mean when I say this thing is empty? Does that mean it's subject to change? Part of that is it's subject to impermanence, but impermanence is its own separate thing that describes impermanence. We don't need to use the word emptiness to describe impermanence necessarily. Impermanence kind of contains its own definition. I know what you mean when you say something is impermanent. I don't yet quite understand what you mean when you say something is empty, if that idea of emptiness is distinct from impermanence.
That's a good question. It is really hard to pin this down because we're looking for something that's not there. That's kind of in the definition, right?
Yeah.
You're looking for an unchanging thing and you can't find it. But if I had to try and add it up, using the terms and the definitions as landmarks that we've been using so far, I would say that emptiness is the property of all things that is the sum of non-self and being acted upon by impermanence.
Okay.
So non-self, like we've said, there's no soul, right? Non-self is there is no permanent, substantial something in sentient beings. That plus impermanence, including all sentient beings and all dharmas in general, that sums up to emptiness.
Gotcha. So emptiness is the result of all of these other more observable properties. I can easily observe impermanence. I can easily observe that things are subject to change. And the sum of all those means it's empty.
Yes, I've actually often taught emptiness as being impermanence plus non-self equals emptiness.
Okay. That helps a lot. And also mentioning that we're looking for something that's not there also helps.
Yeah, because this is the reason why I initially thought that you were talking about the debate is because the debate is a question of, is the absence of something itself? When there is nothing, is that something? It's kind of confusing to talk about it in those words, but can we point at something and say that that's nothing? That's kind of what all this debate was centered around. And the answer is you really can't, because if you could, that would be a paradox. It would be an oxymoron, and It would violate the definition. So, but yes, it is essentially being acted upon by impermanence and having the property of non-self.
Okay, that helps a lot.
Yeah.
That makes this a lot more clear. All right. So let's get back to the script. So how does the definition of emptiness change over time in Buddhism?
Yeah, so as we have discussed a little bit, emptiness started out as the doctrine of non-self. That was central to the early teachings of Buddhism. Then it came to be maximized to include all dharmas in the dharma realm. Everything subject to non-self and subject to impermanence. In Mahayana Buddhism, emptiness discourse explodes to the point where there is too much change over time in the definitions and in the use of the term to discuss in one episode. However, there are some important trends in the discourse that can be mentioned here. So let's start with the Madhyamaka school. We've recommended the works of Nagarjuna, the founder of this school, in translation for the entire duration of the podcast because his discourse on emptiness is perhaps the most important for the foundation of the rest of Mahayana Buddhism that comes after him. Whether or not a given Mahayana school agrees with Nagarjuna, they are in some way engaging and responding to his work, and thus we can think of him as a landmark in the development of Mahayana doctrine. He argues that because things arise out of causes and conditions, they must all be empty of any inherent substantial nature, because there is nothing that exists outside of causality, nothing that exists outside of causes and conditions. There is nothing that can arise without causes and conditions. This is actually the law of thermodynamics. You cannot create something out of nothing. You cannot turn something into nothing. This is causality and causation in Buddhism, and he is simply connecting that to emptiness. Because things arise causally, they are manifestations of the causes and conditions that cause them to arise. In other words, the absolute cannot arise out of the relative. All things that arise out of causes and conditions are merely impermanent manifestations of those causes and conditions, and they disappear over time. However, we do experience them as things in reality. We do experience them as dharmas. Though a coffee cup is a manifestation of the efforts of many people and many machines to turn dirt, heat, ink, glaze, etc. into a coffee cup, we only see the coffee cup. We can't point to anything on the coffee cup and say that is the efforts of the person that drove that coffee cup in an 18-wheeler truck to the store from the factory, and that is the effort of, the person who glazed the ceramics. We don't see that other stuff. It's kind of paved over for us. That's the limitations of our sensory abilities, and that's what we're seeking to perfect and to expand upon through meditation and study. So, according to Nagarjuna, we have to strive to perfect our understandings of these things and see everything in everything that we see. We have to see all of the characteristics of a thing that we experience in our reality. He believes this is true liberation because even our very minds and bodies are manifestations of causes and conditions. And thus, to reach nirvana and enlightenment is to realize the causality of self and to use it to direct yourself toward enlightenment. There are a lot of important doctrinal foundations here that I want to cover. One is that nihilism and existence are both widely negated in this system. That's because of the doctrine of the two truths. The two truths are the absolute truth, that everything in reality is empty of any substantial nature or existence, and the conventional truth, or the provisional truth, that things still exist provisionally, temporarily, conditionally, before our very eyes. Like I said before, emptiness does not reject the provisional existence of things in our daily lives. It does not reject our daily life experiences. The other important thing I want to mention is that from this doctrine, we can see relative continuity instead of random chaos or what the Buddhists would call nihilism. Remember that nihilism is the idea that the random chaos of the universe precludes any real meaning or purpose to existence, any real direction or consistency to existence. In the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness, there is meaning and purpose to the relative continuity that we can experience. That meaning and purpose is that through knowledge of causation, through knowledge and harnessing of dependent origination, one can create the causes and conditions for awakening. There's not simply random, unpredictable chaos. A will eventually turn into B, and then to C, and so on. But A will not immediately turn into Z, or J, or the number 7. It will pretty much always turn into B, and then C, and so on. Using that, we can create the causes and conditions that lead to our own enlightenment and the enlightenment of other sentient beings. So even though emptiness is the case, even though impermanence is the case, it's not like random crap is going to happen all the time that is impossible to understand, impossible to make sense of, impossible to navigate. And so therefore, even though nothing has substantial existence, permanence, or consistency, we can still see enough continuity to get by in our daily lives. The coffee cup may eventually turn back into a different kind of dirt and dust, but I think that in an hour, it's probably still going to be a coffee cup, unless we drop it or something.
So we could talk about how enlightenment is, at least in part, recognizing all of the dirt, ink, glaze, and the effort that people and machines put into it.
Exactly. Enlightenment, as we talked about before, is omniscience. So when the Buddha looks at a person, he can see the entire karmic past, present, and future of that person. And when he looks at a thing, he can see the entire, what you might call, object history of that thing. What it was, what it is, what it will be. And the reason for that is because he's mastered causation. He's mastered knowledge of dependent origination. He's mastered an understanding of how causes and conditions and how karma work. Karma is really just nothing more than the law of causality, the law of causes and conditions that cause things to happen, right? So a good cause, a good condition will turn into a good cause and a good condition. And a bad cause and a bad condition will cause bad ones. And it's very simple to think of it that way. But the Buddha has really, really mastered the knowledge of all of the specific causes and conditions that cause specific things afterwards. And because he has that extremely deep knowledge and wisdom, then he has omniscience and therefore enlightenment. It seems like it's easy, right, to just say to yourself, oh, I understand that X causes Y in principle, therefore I'm enlightened. But as we've seen in our own daily lives, there is a lot of random stuff that happens. And it seems random to us. It seems random and chaotic and bad to us because we just simply don't have the knowledge of its causes and conditions. If we were enlightened like the Buddha, we would. And we would not ever encounter anything that's random. We would have pre-knowledge and omniscience. We would have knowledge of everything that's going to happen to us and to everyone else over time. And we would be peaceful and content in that regard.
Makes sense. And it kind of goes back to something that I've dealt with in computer science back when I was still doing the software development thing. Actual random numbers in a computer are impossible. So a computer cannot actually generate random numbers. What's actually happening is that a computer is doing something so obfuscated that it appears to be random to the observer. But if I know how computers work, if you give me the complete state of a computer and enough time to go through the processes that go through generating a random number, I could tell you what number would be next in a random number generator. It is something that can be calculated. And I guess we could think of enlightenment as the Buddha understanding reality the way I conceivably understand a computer's random number generator.
Exactly. That's exactly how you might conceive of it. And it poses an interesting question that we can't explore too much with the time we have today, but is still something that is worth thinking about. True randomness, absolutely true randomness in the context of computer science relies on infinity, but computers physically and computationally rely on finite numbers, right? They can go to really, really extremely large numbers that you and me cannot possibly conceive of in our own minds, but ultimately there are limits. There are limits in the math. There are limits to the hardware. There's limits that cannot be transcended by the limited, right? And the question that poses in enlightenment is, in the conditioned, us being conditioned, us being limited, finite, us being marked by suffering, impermanence, non-self, can we even grasp infinite? Can we even grasp unconditioned? Can we even grasp all of it, right? There's lots of debates about whether or not enlightenment is actually possible, because who can actually sit down and learn everything? And I say that not as a generalization or a simplification. I mean that very specifically. Who can sit down and make themselves know everything? The Buddhists are typically optimistic and pessimistic about this. The path is long and arduous and infinite, and it takes 3 kalpas or more, and kalpas, as we talked about, are an immeasurable length of time, but ultimately it is attainable. It's just attainable at the end of a very long and arduous journey. But there are philosophical debates, understanding that, okay, infinity, unconditionedness, it's all paved over by delusion and by misunderstanding and by conditionality, by finiteness. Can we actually unpave it? Can we actually get through that pavement and understand what's going on? And that's a question that I don't think anyone's answered satisfactorily yet, but I do think that people are still trying.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's episode on emptiness, and a little more at the end of it. Join us next week, where we will be discussing the Buddhist character King Yama. Who is King Yama? Where does he come from? How does he fit into the system of karma and reincarnation? We hope to see you there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or a review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. Tweet us at brightbuddhism, and join us on our Discord server, the Hidden Sangha, link in description. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you very much.